Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well out there today. For those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Derek Royden. I'm a freelance writer and journalist. I do a story every week for nationofchange.org. You should definitely check out the site, really great progressive American website. So for today's story, I'm going to look at one that I did a couple of weeks ago called Who's Afraid of Tulsi Gabbard? I think it's still relevant because I think this is really going to be relevant like as long as Tulsi Gabbard is in the running for the Democratic nomination. And if she wins, it's just going to go on and on. And there are some legitimate things to criticize her for, but I do think, like for certain other candidates, like Bernie Sanders, Ilhan Omar, of course, the congresswoman from Minnesota, who's been just brutally criticized this week, and Jeremy Corbyn in England, who I'm writing about right now, also who's just come in for criticism that is so over the top. While other people kind of skate by, Gabbard has really just been pilloried in the press. I begin. In anticipation of the 2020 presidential race, 9 candidates, might be more now, have already announced that they are running for the Democratic nomination. Although Bernie Sanders has yet to fully officially declare his candidacy, if he does as expected, he will have more competition than the last go-round from actual progressives, including 2 already in the running, Elizabeth Warren and Tulsi Gabbard. And Elizabeth Warren, of course, lately has been having her own problems. Gabbard came into the U.S. Congress in 2012 after primarying the Democratic incumbent in Hawaii's 2nd and easily winning election in the reliably Democratic district. Although her calm, plain-spoken style had already won her something of a following, especially among her fellow lawmakers, she first became really visible to U.S. progressives nationwide in late February of 2016. At this time, the Congresswoman did this by resigning her post as one of the 5 vice chairs on the Democratic National Committee to give Senator Sanders her endorsement after her call for more debates went unheeded. In the fall of that year, it was revealed by WikiLeaks' release of the Podesta emails that what came across as a principled stance, cheered by the Democratic left, had made Gabbard enemies among donors and the centrist Clinton wing of the party. An email to Gabbard with the subject line "Disappointed," sent by Darnell Strom and Michael Kives, 2 Hollywood agents and donors, the former having also worked on and off with former President Bill Clinton since at least 2005, was forwarded to Podesta and later published by WikiLeaks as part of the trove. For you to endorse a man, Sanders, who has spent almost 40 years in public office with very few accomplishments doesn't fall in line with what we previously thought of you, they wrote. Hillary Clinton will be our party's nominee, and you standing on ceremony to support the sinking Bernie Sanders ship is disrespectful to Hillary Clinton. Strom and Kives wrote, ironically, somewhat disrespectfully. While any candidate in the 2020 race should be scrutinized for past statements and beliefs, Gabbard 37 is already facing more than most from the Democratic establishment and its media allies, not only for her actions in 2016, but also for her clear anti-interventionist stance over the past few years, something which puts her far outside the Democratic mainstream, at least as it's currently constituted. Some of the criticism is easily dismissed, such as those who call the Congresswoman, who traveled to Syria in 2017 and met with President Assad and other government officials, an Assad apologist. Gabbard continues to be taken to task for this trip, with former Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill, and let's note the former there because she lost her election in 2018, calling her the Syrian president's bestie shortly after she announced her candidacy this month. Interviewed on CNN after she returned from the war-torn country, the Congresswoman explained why she chose to meet with Assad. When the opportunity arose to meet with him, I did so because I felt it's important that if we profess to truly care about the Syrian people, about their suffering, then we've got to be able to meet with anyone that we need to if there's a possibility that we could achieve peace. And that's exactly what we talked about. And this is something that's really important. We don't have to, to deal in diplomacy, to work with other countries, you don't have to necessarily like the leaders of those countries or even believe that they live up to like basic norms and values and democratic values. Sometimes you have to negotiate with these people because the other things that are there are much, much worse. I would argue in the case of Syria, this was certainly true. The country has a very diverse population, both ethnically and religiously. They've managed to get along for a very long period of time without too much violence. I mean, the violence that has exploded there since this war started, with groups like Al Qaeda and ISIS. We don't want these groups are even beyond diplomacy. They wouldn't even be groups that we could deal with if they were to come into power. But it's not apologizing for Assad. We know that there's torture in Syrian prisons. We know that there's bad things that happened even before, obviously, this multi-sided conflict started. We're simply arguing that it's better to try and deal with this in a situation where things are peaceful in the country through diplomatic means. Also, Assad has some pretty big backers that, Russia and China, who it should be a concern. You don't want to touch off a larger war with a country like Russia over Syria. You want to create the conditions for peace for the people there as quickly as possible, end the violence, and spend the money to rebuild a country that the West is at least partly, if not mostly, responsible for it being destroyed, along with allies like Turkey and, of course, the Gulf state countries who poured probably massive amounts of money into these groups that destabilized the country and have really just had a reign of terror for years. Gabbard, a veteran who served in Iraq and Kuwait, hasn't only showed concern for victims of the multi-sided brutality, but has also been tirelessly calling for an end to U.S. support for the Saudi-led intervention in Yemen in the U.S. Congress. She's also one of the few, along with newly elected Congresswoman Ilhan Omar and Senator Sanders, to object to the current saber-rattling coming out of Washington in regards to long-suffering Venezuela. This is once again another thing. I can't support a coup in Venezuela, but we also can't fail to note that the Maduro government has certainly made many mistakes along the way. Sanctions are not going to help to alleviate the economic suffering of the Venezuelan people, and it just seems shameful for the United States, for Canada to be going along with this, for most of the EU to be going along with this idea of overthrowing the legitimately elected government of Venezuela. If the opposition in Venezuela had contested the last election, who knows, they might very well have won. They decided to boycott the election, and now they're deciding to put some man who comes from nowhere in the presidency. Basically, foreign powers are deciding this, and it's right that Tulsi Gabbard should stand up against it. I have many friends who are Venezuelan. I understand their pain, at watching their country seem to unravel, but at the same time, I mean, in matters of international law, we have to try, especially keep the great powers, keep them following the rules. One of the arguments I often make is that if it wasn't for the Iraq war, the Saudis would have never thought to intervene in Yemen. They would have continued to try and manipulate the country using their money. It just brought disaster after disaster. It hasn't even been recognized beyond its own scope, the 2003 Iraq war, for the disaster that it's been for many other countries. More troubling in regards to Syria and Iraq, Gabbard backed a bill in late 2015 to stop 10,000 refugees from these countries from settling in the United States, and in that time period insisted that President Obama should use the phrase radical Islamic terrorism to describe these groups, then a favorite right-wing talking point that maligns an entire religion by association. Now, I do have a problem with this. I think this is especially the latter part, although actually no, the refugee resettlement is terrible too, but the latter part is just completely intellectually dishonest, and it really does smear a billion people for the sake of trying to name an enemy pointlessly, in my opinion. And I believe, from reading the website, she has a page on Islam and Islamophobia, and I believe, she's changed her opinion on this. And we have to take people at their word when they say that they've changed their opinions on these things. It doesn't excuse maybe some of the statements she's made in the past, but people can evolve, and we can't always hold them to absolutely perfect standards, especially a politician. And you should remember that Tulsi Gabbard isn't kind of like AOC or this new group of Congress people. She's very much a traditional politician in a lot of ways. And so we have to look at that. But she's been consistent on these anti-war, anti-interventionist positions for a number of years now, and even more consistent, I think, than Bernie Sanders or certainly than Elizabeth Warren. So I think that this should be taken into account. We need a voice on that stage that is criticizing these wars that are just, not only damaging to the people, but damaging to the history of the areas where they're fighting, and damaging to the environment in a way that's really not very much discussed. So the article goes on a little bit. You can definitely get to it through a link here on the blog, or if you're on YouTube, I'll put a link to it there. Thanks very much for watching. I hope everyone out there is doing really well, and that you always remember,